In the summer of 2005, the small Illinois town of Millbridge was rocked by a chilling crime that would haunt the residents for years to come. Millbridge was the kind of town where neighbors greeted each other by name, and parents rarely worried about letting their children play outside alone. It was on an otherwise uneventful June afternoon that Emma Thompson and Julia Foster set off to Hawthorne Park, a popular gathering spot surrounded by dense woods and winding trails. The two friends had been inseparable since kindergarten, and their families were close-knit, woven into the town's social fabric. Emma's mother, Margaret Thompson, watched her daughter leave with Julia and thought nothing of it. But as dusk settled in and the girls still hadn't returned, a sense of unease quickly escalated to fear. By midnight, Margaret and her husband, Steve Thompson, along with Julia's parents, had combed through the park grounds with flashlights, shouting the girls' names. Their panic intensified as hours passed without any sign of the girls. By dawn, the local police had been alerted, and a formal search party was deployed, expanding their perimeter to the outskirts of the park. Then, as morning sunlight pierced the forest canopy, searchers stumbled upon a ghastly scene that would forever scar Millbridge. The lifeless bodies of Emma and Julia lay in a shallow glen, their small frames riddled with stab wounds. News of the murder spread rapidly. What had started as a hopeful search for two missing girls had transformed into a full-scale homicide investigation. Law enforcement quickly sealed off the crime scene, marking it as the epicenter of a nightmarish chapter in the town's history. Forensic teams collected every piece of potential evidence they could find, combing the area with grim determination. In the initial days, their optimism was palpable. They believed they could catch the killer quickly. Yet, as days turned into weeks with no leads, that confidence began to erode, leaving the town in a haze of grief and suspicion. Steve Thompson, Emma's father, became an early suspect in the investigation. A heavy-set man with a rough demeanor, he had a history of minor criminal activity that had been overlooked by the town until now. The local police saw him as a convenient target. His past brushes with the law made him an easy person to scrutinize. Under mounting pressure to solve the case, authorities brought him in for questioning repeatedly, each time escalating their tactics. After hours of grueling interrogation, Steve broke. Exhausted, he mumbled a halting confession, which was hastily documented by the detectives as a formal admission of guilt. But the confession was strange, almost incoherent, and he later retracted his words, claiming he had only confessed under extreme duress. Despite his retraction, Steve's confession was enough to charge him formally. The district attorney, eager to present a resolution to the grieving families and the fearful town, moved swiftly. The media latched onto the story, painting Steve as a violent man who had somehow snapped. The community was divided. Some believed his guilt, while others saw him as a scapegoat. What few could have anticipated, however, was that Steve Thompson's confession would be merely the beginning of a labyrinthine saga that would take years to unravel. Steve Thompson's trial began in early 2006, with a somber courtroom packed with townspeople, media, and the families of Emma and Julia. His defense lawyer argued that Steve's confession had been coerced and that the investigation was deeply flawed. As evidence, he pointed out the physical inconsistencies in Steve's confession and the lack of direct forensic evidence linking him to the crime scene. However, the prosecution countered by emphasizing his criminal history and unstable temperament. Steve's fate seemed all but sealed, until a startling twist threatened to upend the prosecution's case entirely. An independent forensic analyst hired by the defense examined DNA samples collected from Emma's body. The analysis revealed foreign DNA that did not match Steve's genetic profile. It was a potential game changer, casting serious doubt on his involvement. Yet, to the shock of Steve's attorney and supporters, the prosecutor refused to admit the evidence, arguing that it was irrelevant to the case at hand. The prosecutor maintained that Steve's confession, albeit retracted, remained the most substantial piece of evidence, and the court agreed. In the absence of undeniable evidence of innocence, Steve was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. While Steve languished behind bars, unable to appeal the court's decision, life in Millbridge carried on. For most residents, the conviction brought a measure of closure, a way to move on from the tragedy. Yet the Foster and Thompson families, once bound by friendship, were left in tatters, each tormented by lingering doubts. Margaret Thompson struggled with her faith in the justice system, torn between her belief in her husband's innocence and the unbearable guilt that gnawed at her. For Julia's parents, the conviction didn't erase their sorrow, but it gave them a semblance of peace, at least for a time. Then, in 2009, another horror unfolded, hundreds of miles away in Arlington, Virginia. Jessica Bailey, a 24-year-old Army service member, disappeared from her base, sparking an immediate search. 3 days later, her body was found in a wooded area outside of town, showing signs of strangulation. The killing bore no immediate connection to the murders of Emma and Julia, but it caught the attention of federal investigators who recognized disturbing similarities in the manner of death. A year later, a series of attacks on young women in the Washington, D.C. area led authorities to Carlos Avila Martinez, a 29-year-old man with a long history of petty crimes. After a tense standoff with law enforcement, he was arrested and held for questioning. Martinez's criminal record and volatile personality made him a prime suspect in the recent spate of violent crimes, but investigators had no idea just how many skeletons might be buried in his past. Under pressure to confess, Martinez admitted to the recent assaults and even volunteered chilling details about a murder in Illinois in 2005. The confession led investigators to submit his DNA for analysis in an array of unsolved cases. When the results came back, they revealed a connection that stunned everyone involved. Martinez's DNA matched the samples taken from Emma Thompson's body nearly 5 years earlier, the same evidence that had been ruled inadmissible in Steve's trial. This revelation set off a firestorm of backlash against the Illinois authorities, raising questions about the integrity of the original investigation and the disturbing oversight that had allowed a killer to remain free. The revelation of Carlos Avila Martinez's DNA match shook the foundation of the Illinois justice system. Steve Thompson's case, once considered closed, was thrust back into the spotlight, sparking outrage from civil rights groups, journalists, and the local community. News outlets ran with the headline "Innocent Man Framed," "Justice System Blunders Cost Lives," and the Thompson family's long-fought battle for Steve's innocence became national news. For many, Steve's wrongful conviction represented a chilling example of the failures within the criminal justice system, and now public pressure mounted on the prosecutor's office to review the case. For Steve, the news arrived as a bittersweet victory, tinged with the grief of the years he'd spent behind bars. In his tiny prison cell, he'd come to terms with the notion that he might die a convicted murderer. Now, however, as evidence of his innocence emerged, he struggled with the complex reality of potential freedom. While his name might be cleared, he had lost years of his life, his daughter, and his reputation. Yet, as prison officials delivered the news that an official review of his case was underway, a flicker of hope returned to his weary heart. The Illinois Innocence Project took up Steve's case, drawing attention to the botched handling of evidence, the coerced confession, and the prosecutor's refusal to acknowledge the DNA evidence from the original trial. At every turn, the signs of systemic failure were glaringly evident. Experts dissected the case, exposing multiple oversights, from the mishandling of forensic evidence to the intimidating tactics used during Steve's interrogation. The media followed every development with a morbid fascination, focusing particularly on the lack of accountability from the officials responsible for Steve's wrongful conviction. As Steve's legal team prepared for an appeal, Carlos Avila Martinez's criminal history was brought into the spotlight. Known to law enforcement as a transient figure with a long record of petty crimes, Martinez had evaded serious punishment for years. His mobility across state lines had enabled him to stay under the radar, avoiding capture even as his crimes escalated. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a disturbing pattern that connected Martinez to a string of unsolved violent incidents stretching back nearly a decade. This evidence suggested that his attack on Emma and Julia in 2005 might have been only the beginning. In a procedural hearing that would lead to Steve's release, a judge reviewed the mounting evidence of Martinez's involvement. Forensic specialists testified about the DNA evidence, and criminal psychologists painted a profile of Martinez as a compulsive offender. Meanwhile, Steve's defense attorney argued vehemently against the credibility of his coerced confession, presenting details of the interrogation techniques that had been used against him. Finally, in a monumental decision, the judge overturned Steve's conviction, citing gross misconduct on the part of the original investigators and prosecutors. After nearly 5 years behind bars, Steve was declared a free man. Yet freedom was no cure for the damage done. Steve emerged from prison to a world he no longer recognized. The once familiar streets of Millbridge now felt foreign and unwelcoming. For many in the town, the stigma surrounding his case persisted, casting a shadow over his release. While Steve had been formally exonerated, whispers of doubt lingered among some residents who still saw him as guilty. His attempts to reconnect with the community were met with thinly veiled suspicion and the painful realization that, despite his freedom, true acceptance was still out of reach. In the weeks following Steve's release, his lawyers pursued compensation for his wrongful conviction. The case presented strong evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, leading Illinois to offer a settlement of $8 million, intended to cover the years of suffering, lost wages, and irreparable damage to his family's life. But for Steve, the money was hollow consolation. He'd lost more than he could ever regain the chance to see his daughter grow up, to support his family, and to be a part of the memories that should have marked her teenage years. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against Carlos Avila Martinez progressed swiftly as mounting evidence tied him to not only Emma and Julia's murders, but also Jessica Bailey's and numerous attacks in Washington, D.C. Martinez's DNA, now recorded in multiple state databases, was linked to cold cases across Illinois, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, establishing a sinister path of destruction. In every town he passed through, he left behind a trail of grief-stricken families and unresolved cases, slipping away each time with disturbing ease. The trial garnered national attention, and the courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' families, and investigators who'd been haunted by Martinez's crimes for years. The prosecution built an ironclad case, presenting overwhelming evidence of his involvement in the murders. Martinez had confessed under questioning, providing chillingly accurate details about Emma and Julia's final hours, information only the killer could have known. His defense team, faced with undeniable forensic evidence in his admissions, could do little to sway the jury's opinion. In the sentencing phase, the judge addressed Martinez directly, condemning him as a predator who had terrorized communities for nearly a decade. He handed down a sentence of death, along with an additional 100 years in prison for the murders of Emma, Julia, and Jessica. The judge's final words echoed in the courtroom: "The damage you have done to families, to towns, to the very fabric of our society can never be undone." While Martinez's sentencing marked the end of his reign of terror, the case left a bitter residue of frustration and sorrow. It highlighted how police and prosecutors, driven by pressure to solve cases swiftly, had allowed one man's horrific crimes to go unchecked. Had Steve not been wrongfully convicted, had the DNA evidence been properly acknowledged, countless lives might have been spared. For the families of Emma, Julia, and Jessica, justice had come far too late. In the aftermath of the trial, Millbridge became a focal point in the national debate over police practices and wrongful convictions. Public figures, activists, and lawmakers rallied around the case, demanding reforms to prevent similar miscarriages of justice. The Illinois prosecutor's office faced intense scrutiny, with several officials removed from their positions in the wake of the scandal. Policy changes soon followed: revised procedures on evidence handling, stricter standards for interrogations, and greater oversight of prosecutorial decisions. Steve Thompson, however, remained quietly distant from the public discourse. Though he was free, he struggled to rebuild his life in the shadow of loss and betrayal. With his financial compensation, he moved to a new town, seeking anonymity and a fresh start, but his peace remained elusive. He became a reluctant advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking at select events and lending his story to documentaries on wrongful convictions. Each public appearance was a reminder of the nightmare he had endured, but it was a role he accepted out of a sense of obligation to prevent others from suffering the same fate. As years passed, the tragedy of Emma and Julia's deaths settled into the annals of true crime history, a reminder of the consequences of haste and negligence in the pursuit of justice. Yet, for those who lived through it, the pain never fully healed. Emma and Julia's parents, once bound by friendship, had gone their separate ways, each family burdened by grief in their own way. They remembered their daughters as vibrant, inseparable friends, whose lives had been stolen by a stranger, but whose deaths had also been marred by systemic failure. The legacy of the case lingered, a cautionary tale for future generations, a reminder of the lives that had been lost not just to a killer but to a broken system that had failed to recognize the truth. And as Millbridge tried to heal, the town remained haunted by the memories of two young girls who'd gone to the park one summer afternoon and never returned. In the years following Carlos Avila Martinez's sentencing, Millbridge struggled to restore its sense of safety and community. The horrors of 2005 lingered, etched in the minds of those who had been close to Emma and Julia. Parents became wary, watching their children more closely, hesitant to allow the freedoms they had once taken for granted. The story of Emma and Julia's murders became a permanent scar on the town's history, a reminder that innocence could be shattered in an instant. As the media attention faded, the Thompson and Foster families found themselves in isolation, forever marked by their connection to the tragedy. Steve Thompson's release had come with financial restitution, but no amount of money could restore the years lost or mend the relationships fractured by grief and distrust. Millbridge residents, some of whom had once considered Steve a neighbor and friend, now looked at him with an uneasy mixture of sympathy and lingering suspicion. The truth had been revealed, but for many the question of what if lingered. What if he had been involved in some way? What if the confession had been true, and the DNA evidence was merely an oversight? Unable to find peace in Millbridge, Steve moved away, seeking refuge from the whispers that followed him everywhere. His wife, Margaret, filed for divorce not long after his release, their marriage a casualty of years spent battling public scrutiny, legal battles, and the devastating loss of their daughter. Steve tried to build a life in a new town, but the trauma had changed him irreparably. The money he received was invested in small, solitary hobbies, in places where no one knew his past. He spent his days in quiet anonymity, haunted by memories of his daughter and the brief, cruel interrogation sessions that had shattered his life. Meanwhile, Julia Foster's parents had turned their grief inward, seeking solace in their own ways. Julia's mother, Laura Foster, became active in organizations aimed at advocating for victims' rights and supporting the families of missing children. She was haunted by the notion that her daughter's death could have been prevented, that the system's missteps had cost them not only Emma and Julia, but possibly Jessica Bailey and countless others. For Laura, activism was a way to make sense of the senseless, a means of channeling her sorrow into something constructive. Her efforts brought attention to the importance of thorough investigations and ethical law enforcement practices, resonating with families who had been through similar experiences. However, Laura's husband, Tom Foster, took a different path. He withdrew, retreating from both the public eye and his family. He spent hours in his workshop, a small, dimly lit space filled with relics of his daughter's childhood. For him, the presence of Martinez in the world had been a nightmare. But the involvement of the police who had abandoned leads, ignored evidence, and coerced confessions felt like the true betrayal. While his wife spoke of justice reform, he became embittered, unable to forgive the system that had stolen their chance at justice when it had mattered most. In prison, Carlos Avila Martinez was silent for months after his sentencing, refusing interviews, attorney visits, or psychological evaluations. He had admitted to the crimes in chilling detail during his initial confessions, but after the trial he withdrew into himself, as if his violent outburst had finally exhausted him. Investigators from various states tried to question him about other unsolved cases, suspecting that his killing spree may have extended beyond Illinois and Virginia. But for nearly a year he said nothing, leaving the families and authorities to speculate about how many lives he had truly destroyed. Then, in a surprising turn, Martinez requested a meeting with a criminal psychologist, Dr. Lena Becker, known for her research into serial offenders. Dr. Becker had reviewed Martinez's case extensively, fascinated by his erratic pattern and the violence of his methods. She arrived with a detailed plan, hoping to understand his motives and piece together the unspoken stories of his past crimes. During their sessions, Martinez began to speak slowly, cryptically, often in fragmented memories. His accounts were chillingly specific, describing the thrill he felt as he observed potential victims, sometimes stalking them for days before finally attacking. He admitted that he had chosen Emma and Julia on a whim, spotting them alone in the park and realizing the opportunity they presented. For Martinez, they were simply convenient targets, nothing more than a chance encounter in a small-town park. To him, their innocence meant nothing. They were just a momentary thrill in his violent journey. As Martinez detailed his crimes, Dr. Becker probed deeper, uncovering a pattern of impulsive, calculated rage that had shaped his every move. His life on the road, moving from state to state and evading law enforcement, had fueled his sense of invincibility. For years, he had been certain that his crimes would go unpunished, that his mobility and anonymity would shield him from justice. He took pleasure in outsmarting authorities, mocking the detectives who tried and failed to piece together his trail. But Dr. Becker sensed there was more than bravado behind his words. She saw in him a dark void, a near-total lack of empathy that allowed him to commit brutal acts without remorse. As he recounted each crime, he spoke with a chilling calmness, as if recounting events in someone else's life. The crimes that had devastated families and shaken entire towns were, to Martinez, little more than moments of excitement punctuating his empty existence. His confessions revealed connections to other open cases, and slowly investigators were able to link him to at least 5 unsolved murders in neighboring states, each with similar signs of violence and disregard for the victim's humanity. Martinez's accounts matched details only the killer would know, and as more cases were closed, it became clear that his criminal record had been vastly underestimated. These revelations further intensified the backlash against the Illinois justice system. Each newly linked murder added to the indictment of the police and prosecutors who had ignored the original DNA evidence in Emma and Julia's case. Investigative reports highlighted how the narrow focus on Steve Thompson had not only allowed Martinez to roam free, but had also cost lives that could have been spared. The Illinois Attorney General launched an independent review, focusing on flaws in the initial investigation and pledging reforms, but for many these actions were too little, too late. In Millbridge, the tragic case became a permanent stain on the town's legacy. School curriculums included discussions about the importance of due process and the dangers of tunnel vision in investigations, using the Millbridge murders as a case study. Law enforcement officers were given additional training in interrogation techniques, aiming to prevent coerced confessions and ensure a fair process for future suspects. The town sought to turn its painful history into a lesson for the future, but the specter of Emma and Julia's deaths remained.